Hi, folks. Welcome to the inaugural episode of IC Data People. And our first guest here is Dan Entrup. I first met Dan when he had just left GLG, and I was in a role at M Science before going on and running Datavore and then becoming the head of data partnerships at FactSet. So Dan, welcome to IC Data People. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Evan. Thanks, Omri. Great to be here with you today.
So Dan, with that extensive background, how does that give you a unique perspective on what's going on in the data landscape today?
Sure. So if I talk a little bit about each of those companies at high level in terms of what they do, I've seen both the qualitative side as well as the quantitative side of primary research. So spent about 6 years in expert networks doing expert-based research services before moving over to the data space. I've also been both a buyer and a seller of data. And companies I've worked at have ranged from 6 people to 11,000 people and publicly traded. So have worked for a variety of different size companies and in a variety of different roles as well. So I always like to kind of leverage that background and experience to look at some of the challenges that I'm working on at the moment or that others that I'm working with are going through and trying to kind of position things based on some of those experiences along the way.
Then from experience, what is the most powerful insight you've ever seen from data?
I'm a huge fan of human capital analytics and headcount analysis. I just believe, at the core of every business is people. And if your goal is to analyze businesses, whether that's for competitive intelligence purposes, who to sell into, or investment research purposes and investment decision-making, people are generally going to be at the core of all of these businesses, from a financial perspective on the cost side, but also just in terms of operations. So one of my favorite things to look at is how is a company's headcount growth trending and slicing that by role type, by seniority, certain skill sets. What are people hiring for? There's a ton that you can glean when looking at companies and trying to understand the human capital that they have, as well as identifying where there's challenges. So looking at it geographically, are people losing employees? Are people jumping ship to another company in the space and kind of in droves together doing that? There's a lot that you can pull and derive from that and try to understand what's going on at a company. And from that, then determine what you want your action to be based on that. Again, whether that's an investment decision that you're making long or short, you're buying a company, you're targeting a company, you're screening for companies that maybe have high employee turnover, maybe they're distressed situations that you need to come into, or maybe there's high growth at a company and you're selling a product that's sold on a per head basis. You can use that really, it's really powerful insights to be able to prospect from that.
One of the most controversial things is the value of the data. How do you think data insight should be priced?
I would love for one of you to let me know when you solve that, because it does remain a challenge. I believe that kind of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Something is only worth what someone else is willing to pay for it. But how do you get to that number? You have to really understand the customer base that you're selling into. And if you're selling into multiple customer bases, understanding the differences between those. So if I'm selling to a hedge fund, for example, and I can't even just classify hedge fund. Are they long short equity? Are they multi-manager? Are they, do they take a long only strategy? Really truly understanding your customers and how they are using what you're providing and what you're selling to them as a service. The other important thing I think is, what is it all relative to? What else are people purchasing? So there's a lot of companies out there that will say, we have data and therefore it's worth $200,000 because we have an R squared of 0.92. Well, if I go and look even at a quant fund and maybe they were working off of 0.94, you're actually bringing their number down. So, just because you've done your own internal analysis and validation and think that you have a product that is really valuable and on paper as a standalone looks to be valuable, you have to understand what else people are using, both from a usage standpoint to determine how much value they're getting out of it, but also from a procurement and budgeting standpoint as well. Funds in particular, but really all these decision makers are just inundated every day with marketing emails and people trying to pitch them product. And there are funds out there that have over 2,000 different data sets that they're paying for. So every one of those incremental, even if it only costs $20,000 a year, my kind of takeaway I'd want to leave would be truly understand your client base, how they're using that product, Also rarity as well. Is this the only thing out there that can give you that insight? Can that insight be delivered quicker than something else? Is that even important to your clients? Is speed important? Private equity, probably not as much. Large hedge fund trading quarters, very important. So understanding the importance of the different features of your product, I think helps you actually pitch a true solution and just come across more knowledgeable and easier to work with overall. And I think really speeds up that sales process.
So Dan, I'm curious, obviously you mentioned pricing is a challenge. What other major challenges do you see in the data value chain?
There's a number. I think some of them there are people working on, some people are talking about, and others less so. I'd like to highlight two of them. One would be data delivery. Data is not something that's always easy just to send over via email or in an Excel file. There's a pretty extensive chain of data management tools out there, and understanding the tech stack that your clients have may actually influence what you have to build next and changing things on your roadmap. Otherwise, it potentially slows down your sales process. So there are a number of interesting companies out there that are helping with some of these. I think it still remains a major challenge to the buyers who are trying to ingest tons of data and also trying to, while simultaneously, build out the value proposition within their respective companies as well. The other one I think would be mapping data sets together. And this is an area that I think it kind of goes back to understanding your customers, knowing that many of them are going to be using multiple inputs. It's all part of a mosaic research approach, both quantitative and qualitative. If they're using data, they're probably validating some of those points with expert-based research or surveys as well. How do you make it all sync? That is something that many of the clients are finding they have to do on their end. And a lot of their data science and data engineering resources are actually just stitching data sets together. They don't always have the free time to do more advanced statistical analysis, which is really what you want them to be doing and what I think most of them would like to be doing. So I think, again, it's a challenge in the space. I'd love to see more data providers actually come together and collaborate on solving these problems. And I think that's another area that will benefit the providers who do choose to work together and to make their data sets map together. And they can also give a much more robust level of insights if they're going in and selling, again, a full solution as opposed to a feature or an individual product.
I can definitely relate to that. On a different note, what is your most controversial opinion?
I have many controversial opinions. So I'll need you guys to rank order them. One that I frequently say is that data is sold, it's not bought. And what I mean by that is I think that there is a certain level of not hand-holding, but communication of the value of that data that needs to take place. And I think there's been a number of efforts out there to e-commerce sell data and to put it up on a catalog and hope people will come in and click something, view a quick sample, and then click to purchase. I would love to see the world get to that place. That would be pretty cool if we can do that. But I haven't seen anything yet that truly solves that problem. I know people are working on it, so not to downplay the efforts of the companies in the space that are making forward progress with this effort. But I think to date, it still requires people to really explain the value, point out interesting features, but also just ties back to understanding the customer. If you put something up online, you're losing out on the customer persona and understanding how to tailor the pitch based on that customer, or at least most cases I've seen to date. That would be one. I think another would be just back to kind of understanding the value to different clients. Just because you have data doesn't mean that it's relevant to everyone. And not necessarily a controversial opinion, but I think an area that I'm vocal that the industry needs to improve on, especially when people talk about private equity and venture capital and corporates. Going back to my expert network days, I've been hearing that corporates are the next frontier for the past 10 years. And expert networks have actually made progress in that area. But many of them can explain to you how they got there, how they followed their customers, and why that service was relevant in those clients' new seats. But it first took understanding not just what they were doing and how that was different from when their clients were a consultant or an investor, but also understanding corporate procurement and the procurement cycles and the budgeting as well. It's very different, really important to understand. And so I hear a lot of people at conferences talking about how next up, they're going to go into corporates. Or Evan, you and I have looked at a lot of companies together for investment purposes. And I think in just about every one of those, when you see that TAM slide, everyone says, and then we're going to go sell into corporates. And, I'm always very critical of that or scrutinize that to make sure that they truly understand what that actually means. And, that predicting revenue 3 weeks in advance of a public company reporting is not that relevant to a corporation, even if they're a direct competitor. You're not actioning things that quickly and changing your mind on something. So again, just really understanding how people are using that data, how they make decisions, but also how they're set up internally from a procurement process, but also the teams that you're working with and where they sit in the org structure. Less of a controversial opinion, but sort of going with that of something that I've been very vocal about along the way.
So Dan, you mentioned the arc of corporate data procurement for the last 10 years. I'm curious what you see the next 5 years looking like. What's going to change in the data world here in the next 5 years?
So I would love to see, back to something else I mentioned before, I would love to see more data providers collaborating with each other to provide some of that value and to reduce the additional lift that it takes for their end clients to work with data and incorporate that in their research or decision-making process. The companies that I see truly grow the largest are the ones that make it easy for people to work with their data. My other controversial opinion, I still hate the term alternative data, but I'm going to use it here because I think we all know what companies we're talking about. I think there's a lot that can be done. If it's for financial services, mapping to tickers, mapping to products, understanding M&A hierarchies and entity structure. If that work can be done up front, that makes it much easier for someone to plug and play a new data set into their process and not have to also be considering how much lift and how many resources are we going to require, which ultimately is cost and time and opportunity cost. So that's something that I'd partly love to see, but I do expect to see more of that in the future.
Dan, listen, this was great having you. I learned a lot in this conversation. I'm sure everybody else could learn a lot.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, Dan.
Always a pleasure speaking with you guys. Take care.